In this video, I'm going to show you where the patterns that are shipped with Illustrator live. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to apply patterns, and then I'm going to show you how to create a custom pattern, and then I'm going to rotate and scale that pattern. I'm also going to show you how to use an opacity mask to mute the effect of the pattern. So to begin with, the patterns that are in Illustrator live in the Swatches panel. So to get to them, I need to open up my Swatches panel, and I see that I have a few swatches that contain patterns already in my Swatches panel. Anything that I try out will come and live in my recently used swatches. To look for more of them, I'm going to use my Swatches panel menu and click on this. And I'm going to go down to the bottom of this and open up my swatch library. And I'm going to navigate to patterns. And I'm going to go to the basic graphics and start with graphic dots. Okay, so once you have one of the swatch panels open, you can navigate through the rest of the panels to see what the offerings are. These are, again, basic graphic dots, and then we have basic lines, and then basic textures. And then there are legacy decorative swatches that Illustrator has, and then they have a bunch of other patterns that you can use. So that's great if the pattern that you want to use is located within the swatches panel. Unfortunately, there is no scale pattern. So I would like this fish to have scales, and I can't use any of the patterns that are in here because none of them really look like a fish scale. So I'm going to shut this panel menu, and I'm going to make my own pattern. And before I do that, I'm going to open up my layers panel, and I'm going to show you how this document is arranged. Primarily, I have 3 layers, one with text, one with my bubbles, and then I have a fish layer. Under my fish layer, I have all of the parts of my fish, and I have each one of these parts of my fish on a separate sublayer. And at the bottom of my sublayers, I have a layer that contains my color, and I have a layer that will contain my pattern, and I have a layer that I'm going to use as an opacity layer. So I'm going to go back and leave my colored fish body open, and then I'm going to make sure that I'm talking to my empty pattern layer. So when I have this sublayer selected, I can look over to the left hand side and see that I have no fill, but I do have a black stroke. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is collapse my layers panel, and I'm going to make a scale. So if you know anything about fish scales, it's basically a half a circle. So I'm going to create this with my ellipse tool, and I'm going to just draw out a perfect circle holding my shift key down. And then I'm going to take my scissors tool, and I'm going to cut the anchor points at the top and the bottom. Then I'm going to switch back over to my main selection tool, which is V on my keyboard, and I can see that I can move the whole left-hand side of my circle, and I'm going to delete this. Then I'm going to go to my right-hand circle, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see this a little bit better, and I'm going to change this stroke to 1 point. So I could stop here if I wanted to, but I think I'm going to make sure that this scale looks a little bit better, and I'm going to do that in 2 ways. First of all, I'm going to go to my stroke panel, and I'm making sure that the ends of my stroke have a rounded end cap, which they do. And then just to give a little depth to the scale, I'm going to come up to my variable width panel, and I'm going to choose my width profile 1. And then I'm going to go to my stroke selection and increase the weight of my stroke just a little bit. So now that I have this basic semicircle that's a little thicker in the middle than it is at the end, I'm going to use this for my pattern. Before I do that, though, I might as well save this in my symbols panel where I already have my bubble, and just in case I want to use it later or modify it. So I'm going to take my scale into my symbol options panel, and I'm going to name this scale and then save that. All right, so now that I have this scale saved as a symbol, I'm going to go to my Object drop-down menu and I'm going to click Pattern and Make. And that pulls me into my Pattern Options panel. And the first thing that I'm going to do is name my new pattern, Scales. And I see that my scales are arranged in a grid, which is not what fish scales look like. They overlap. So I'm going to use the tile type picker and see what brick by row looks like. And I see that these are overlapped side to side, but not underneath each other. So I'm going to try my next tile type, and that's going to be my brick by column. And when I select that, that is the pattern that I'm looking for. And this actually works just perfectly the way it is right now. So I like this, and I'm done with the options that I want to change, and I'm going to click the check mark for done. So that fill then goes and lives in my Swatches panel where I can use it. So I'm going to go back to my layers, and I'm going to make sure that I have selected the sublayer that contains the path that I'm going to apply my scales fill to. And so I'm going to go back to my swatches and apply my scales, and I see that my fish now has a lot of scales. And that's great, but they're really kind of big. I need a smaller scale, and the way that I'm going to change that is by using my scale tool over here on the left hand side. So the scale tool, once I click it, it's going to apply whatever settings were left in there last. So I'm going to make sure that I have nothing selected while I go double click on the scale tool to see what my settings are. And I see that I have a uniform setting of 100%, which is fine for right now. But down under my options, the thing that I need to uncheck is transform objects, because I don't want to scale the object itself. I want to just scale the pattern within the object. So I'm going to uncheck this, and then I'm going to say OK. And now I'm going to go back to my layers. I'm going to reselect that sublayer, and now I'm going to double click on the scale tool. This is where I can start typing in a number and then clicking on the preview button to see if I like what that looks like. And while 50% of scale looks better, I think I'm going to change this to an even smaller scale, maybe 20%. And I'm going to unselect and select. That might be even too small, so I'm going to take that back up to 30%, and that looks just about how I want this scale to look. So that is how you scale a pattern within a closed path. So I'm going to say that this is okay, and then I'm going to look and rotate this just a little bit. But again, if I'm going to use my rotate tool, I need to see how it's set. So I'm going to unselect my fish and double click on my rotate tool. And I see that my rotate tool is already set to 300 and some odd degrees, so I'm going to reset that to 0. And then I'm going to say OK and get out of this menu, and then go back in and select my pattern sublayer. And now I'm going to click on the rotate tool. And I see that my rotate tool went back to 342. And actually, that's probably where I left it the last time I was fooling around with something. And I don't want these scales to be tipped too much. So I'm going to leave this at like 356. And I'm saying that's okay. It's just tilted a little tiny bit. And I'm going to say okay. And so now I have a scaled and rotated pattern in my closed path that looks like a fish. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do is I want to diminish the look of the scales at the front part of the fish, because fish don't typically have a lot of scales, especially big scales, on their heads. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to use an opacity mask here in Illustrator. And if you're familiar with Photoshop, you should be familiar with masking things off. And you can do this in Illustrator too. And you do it the same way. You use a fill that is filled with a gray scale or black or white. In this case, I have filled the body of this fish with a left to right, white to black gradient. And I'm going to select the opacity layer, and then I'm also going to select my pattern layer. Make sure I have both of these layers selected together. To apply an opacity mask, I need to go to the transparency panel, and when I click on it, I can make a mask from the shape that I have on my sublayer. So I'm going to click Make Mask, and I see that on part of my fish I can't see the scales as easily, but it's on the wrong end. But that's really easy to change. All I need to do is invert my mask to reverse the gradient, and now I have very few scales appearing on the front end of the fish, but I have the scales appearing on the back end of the fish just where I want them. So it's very easy to create a new pattern, and it's very easy to apply that pattern and transform the pattern by scaling it and rotating it, and then applying an opacity mask so you don't see part of that pattern. And that's the end of this tutorial.